Today we start a new study. We're in the book of Proverbs now. The title of our lesson today is Charted Waters. We start in Proverbs chapter 1 and we're going to do verses 7 through 19. The book of Proverbs begins with an invitation and a warning. The invitation comes in the form of a call to be wise. The warning is of trouble that awaits anyone who will not heed the call to live wisely. The knowledge of God and the knowledge to live wisely are interrelated. Next to the knowledge of God and salvation, the knowledge to live wisely is the most important kind of knowledge. Godly knowledge is more than information. It's about transformation. You can be factually right, but spiritually wrong. Solomon's argument in the book of Proverbs is simple. Godly wisdom is applied truth that leads to transformation and wise, practical living. After King David died, Solomon, his son, ruled the kingdom of Israel for 40 years. During his reign, he gained a reputation for being a wise king who composed 3,000 proverbs, or wise sayings. The path leading to God's wisdom starts with a sincere relationship with Him that is marked by healthy respect. Only foolish people discard God's wisdom. Solomon then turned his attention toward his son. His son would need to live according to God's ways. He would need to make up his mind that he would walk in God's wisdom. Making that decision would not be easy, since he would encounter evil people who would try to entice him to join them. They would try to persuade him that the road they took would be fun, but it would involve violence, murder, and theft. Solomon warned that these evil ones would eventually have their lives stolen from them. Solomon portrayed wisdom as an elegant woman. She would invite young people to listen to her, and she would speak to them as an authority figure who deserved respect. If they listened, they could hear her calling to them from above the noise of a foolish world. She would ask them to listen to her so they would not take the path of foolish people. Such people would regret ignoring the wisdom she would have been glad to share. They had been given an opportunity to embrace God's wisdom, but didn't seem to be interested in it. They had their minds only on their own plans. In due time, trouble would come, but wisdom would not be there to help. They would be left to face the consequences of ignoring God's wisdom. By contrast, anyone who paid attention to godly wisdom would have no reason to fear as they face their future. We're going to start with Proverbs 1, verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and discipline. This verse serves as the lens through which Christians look deeply into Proverbs. The true source of knowledge comes into clear view. Another word for knowledge is discernment. In the Old Testament world, knowledge bore a striking similarity to wisdom. Wise believers see things God's way, so they can do things God's way. Wisdom has a starting point. That point is a relationship with the Lord. Some people believe that life experiences bring about wisdom, but without God's help, experience itself can lead a person to draw conclusions that might not be wise at all. Other people think that age brings about wisdom. Age brings about wisdom only if the years have been spent in a deepening walk with the Lord. Neither life experiences nor long life guarantee wisdom. Wisdom comes from the Lord, who works in the experiences and through the years to show His people how to see things His way so we can do things His way. Solomon directed the people of Israel to understand that a productive relationship with the Lord is characterized by fear. Now, fearing God didn't mean that He terrorized them or He made them dread the idea of being in His presence. Instead, fearing God means respecting Him. It's the kind of fear that stops us dead in our tracks, yet invites us to be transformed by God's power. Their respect for the Lord would bring about their love for Him. Solomon encouraged them to take their walk with the Lord seriously. A sincere walk with the Lord would allow their love for Him to be demonstrated in their respect for Him. By contrast, fools have no use for God. They don't cherish the wisdom He can give. They despise His wisdom and even make fun of it. Foolish people pass on the possibility of a fulfilling relationship with Him, and they turn their backs on His discipline. Their foolish choices leave them unprepared to face the challenges that come every day, as well as the outcomes that will confront them in eternity. Throughout the book of Proverbs, the contrast between wisdom and foolishness will come into view quite often. It will encourage us to develop a deepening walk with the Lord and to seek His wisdom. It will also nudge us to pray for people in our circle of relationships who have made the foolish choice to reject Him. Excuse me. Verse 8 says, "Listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and don't reject your mother's teaching." Solomon now began to instruct his own son. He was probably talking to Rehoboam, the son who would become the next king, and Rehoboam would need to learn how to lead God's people when he took his father's place as king. He would need God's wisdom to rule well. For that reason, the sayings Solomon collected would be worth their weight in gold to him in due time. But these proverbs would have been useful to any of Solomon's sons or to any young person on the road to adulthood. By encouraging his own son to listen, Solomon pointed to an important discipline for growing in God's wisdom. Listening means more than just hearing. Hearing sometimes means no more than just waiting for our turn to talk. Listening means paying attention, absorbing, interpreting, and applying what's being said. God's wisdom comes to believers who learn the discipline of listening. Solomon urged his son to listen to his instructions. The worst decision his son could make would be to ignore his father's instructions. Solomon also told his son to pay close attention to what his mother taught him. Verse 9 says, "For they will be a garland of favor on your head and pendants around your neck." Solomon has pointed out the need to take God's wisdom seriously. Now he is focusing on the reward that awaited God's people who put it into practice. He highlighted the reward by comparing it to two items of clothing that signified victory and honor. The items of clothing people in Israel wore spoke volumes about their identity in the world. A garland placed on their head signified they had accomplished something important. The garland proclaimed their victory and the honor that went with it. By connecting garland with seeking wisdom, Solomon assured his son that God would show him favor. In other words, God would be gracious to him as he lived in wisdom. When we think about God's favor, we may be tempted to consider it a reward we must earn, but God is gracious. He gives us wisdom as a gift, and we should display it in our lives. We wear God's gracious blessing of wisdom like a crown of victory and honor. Solomon also spoke about pendants. Pendants signified honor. People wore pendants to signify an honorable status. By mentioning a pendant, Solomon urged his son to rest in the certainty that God's wisdom would render a life of true honor. Verses 10 through 12 say, "My son, if sinners entice you, don't be persuaded. If they say, 'Come with us, let's set an ambush and kill someone. Let's attack some innocent person just for fun. Let's swallow them alive like Sheol, who like those who go down to the pit.'" Solomon was concerned for his son, and he instructed him to avoid the temptation of joining a group of bad influencers. For a young person, the temptation to accept this gang's invitation would be hard to resist. To resist the temptation, his son would need to determine ahead of time that he would turn down the invitation. Solomon described these gang members as sinners. They had rejected God's ways and had embraced a life aimed only at pleasing themselves. They just wanted to have fun, and they wanted others to join in the fun with them. Their recruiting efforts could be extremely persuasive. Anyone who will listen to them could be persuaded to join them. Their invitation would be filled with the promise of excitement and adventure. Solomon prepared his son by telling him exactly what they would say. Being acquainted with their enticing invitation in advance would prepare his son well. He would be in a better position to resist the invitation when he heard it from one of the gang members. The notion of setting an ambush for someone passing by would have devilish charm to it. To these gang members, murdering a person would not be viewed as a crime. Instead, it would be the source of an emotionally powerful rush. For them, killing an innocent person would be a way to have fun. They would say that murdering someone would be like swallowing them alive. The privilege of swallowing someone alive had been reserved for Sheol, or the place of the dead. The gang members would then go on to brag about how they would swallow someone whole in the same way that the pit, or an open grave, would gulp down a corpse. Verses 13 through 14 say, "We'll find all kinds of valuable property and fill our houses with plunder. Throw in your lot with us, and we'll share the loot." Solomon now addressed another thing that the gang members would say to entice someone to join them. They would say that murdering an innocent person would be a way to gain wealth. They would defy God by taking someone's life, which only God has the authority to do. And they would feed their greed at the same time. So any young person who thought about what it would be like to be rich, which is probably all the young people, they would have a hard time turning down this invitation. They could just imagine the valuable property they would get without having to work for it, and without having to wait for it. Their house would soon be filled with the wealth that came from property they would steal from the people they murdered. The gang would say that their invitation came with a guarantee. Anyone who accepted this offer could count on the integrity of the murderers and thieves to keep their word. And they promised that every gang member would get a fair share of the loot. Verses 15 and 16 say, "My son, don't travel that road with them or set foot on their path, because their feet run toward evil and they hurry to shed blood." Solomon again encouraged his son to resist the temptation to go along with these gang members. He said they had chosen to travel foolish roads that they considered to be thrilling. The adventure would give them opportunities to kill and to steal property that didn't belong to them. It sounded entertaining and fun to these gang members. Solomon pointed out that the road wouldn't take them where they wanted to go. For that reason, his son would be wise if he determined not to give their offer any consideration at all. Getting on that road would start with one step. So Solomon urged his son never to take that step. Verses 17 through 18 say, "It is useless to spread a net where any bird can see it, but they set an ambush to kill themselves. They attack their own lives." The saying about the bird and the net might be a little difficult to interpret at first. Some scholars say it means that a bird might be watching the person who's trying to spread a net. The bird sees the net being spread, and they would stay away from the grain that is lying on the ground inside it. Other scholars point to the fact that the birds would get trapped because they can only see grain, but they don't see the net. Either way of that, the picture of the bird and the net point to the outcome for people who ignore God. They take the path of selfish indulgence in which others pay a high price for their enjoyment. When they follow this foolish path, they don't notice the deadly trap that's been set for them by their evil behavior. It's not visible to them at first. It only comes into view when they fall into it. In the shadows, they waited for the chance to ambush others, but they ended up being ambushed themselves by their actions. They set out to attack others so they can kill them, but their actions cost them their own lives. They become trapped by their own plots to kill someone else. Verse 19 says, "Such are the paths of all who make profit dishonestly. It takes the lives of those who receive it." No wonder Solomon tried to warn his son about the path foolish people would take when greed overtook them. Their greed would guide their hands to take anything they wanted, even if they got it dishonestly. They would always be looking around for opportunities to profit from the valuables that they could take from someone else. Greedy for more, they would stop short of nothing so that they could have what they wanted. Ignoring God's wisdom still puts a person's life in jeopardy. For that reason, mature Christians eagerly seek His wisdom through His Word. We want to please Him, not ourselves, so we must reject greed. The unwise person ends up on the path of self-destruction. The unwise person is blind to what's happening. Self-destructive behavior is often hidden from the very person who is self-destructing. Too often the unwise person has become so blinded to his own behavior, he thinks he is only experiencing a season of bad luck or a series of heartbreaks that have nothing at all to do with the ill-conceived and ill-advised choices they made. Godly wisdom will remove the blinders that cover the eyes of the unwise, helping them to see the connection between their universe, ungodly choices, and the tragic consequences those choices produce. We have to be prepared to not be enticed by those who want us to join those foolish paths, and to be ready to walk down the godly paths, serving our Lord. Thank you.